Okay.
Should I leave the meeting? Why does it always give that option? Like when you start recording a meeting, it's like, okay, do you want to leave the meeting or do you want to stay? So funny too. But okay, I was still admitting people.
Yeah, go for it. I will be during admission, so if you want to get us started.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us for this amazing event. My name is Maxine Joseph, as my window probably tells you, and I am one of the, I guess, administrators for this youth leadership event. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Saeed Hill. Dr. Hill is the Assistant Director of Prevention and Masculine Engagement at the Center for Awareness, Response, and Education, also known as CARE. He develops and implements strategies to improve masculine engagement in the prevention of violence. His work focuses on leading collaborative efforts at Northwestern in men's engagement, programming, and education around healthy masculinity, which includes serving as the advisor for masculinity, allyship, reflection, and solidarity, peer education group, as well as the management, implementation, and curriculum development of the NU Men program each quarter. He also serves as a confidential survivor advocate and support for students impacted by sexual violence, relationship violence, and stalking. So thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for taking this time out of your very busy Saturday to speak with us and have this awesome conversation with us.
For sure. Thanks so much. Appreciate being here and the opportunity just to speak with y'all today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here in a second, but we'll start off with a few intros and things like that, and you'll see here in a second what we're looking for. But yeah, appreciating the opportunity to speak with y'all this morning. So let's get into it. Cool. Can everyone see this? Looking good. All right, awesome. And I'll explain some of the titles today, but yeah, so just wanting to start off by saying again, appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to y'all. So I'm here today just to talk through a little bit about what's been going on with mental health and the pandemic in particular. Appreciate that introduction from Maxine. Based on my title and stuff like that, I am a counseling psychologist. So part of the reason I assume I'm also here is to be able to talk through from a psychologist lens, but also the work I do, that lens of what has just experiencing the pandemic been like for youth mental health in particular. And so I'll talk a little bit more about some of those specifics here in a second. But I also want to point out that, the name of even this event around the pandemic, and you'll notice that I replaced the word pandemic with the word syndemic, which I will explain here in a little bit. But to get us started, a couple of things I wanted to mention. One is that we would love to know who's here with us today. So we're looking for in the chat, if you feel comfortable with that, just giving some names. So your names, pronouns, if you feel comfortable with that. Year in school, would love to know just the plethora of different folks that are here, just how many different year ranges are here today. And also I thought something that could be fun is if you could choose a superpower, like any superpower you'd want to just have. I'm curious what that might be. So I'll go ahead and start us off with that. So again, like Maxim said, so my name is Saeed. I do use he and him pronouns. My year in school is like infinity at this point, but I do have a PhD. Graduate high school, graduate undergrad, and graduate school to get my PhD. So I'm actually in my third full year at Northwestern University as their assistant director. And I've been a psychologist for a few years now, but I've been working on my PhD for even longer than that, for about 10 years. So I've been seeing clients and students and folks from mental health services as a clinician for probably 11 years now, I guess it's been. Yeah. So I used to specialize in couples and family therapy with a specialization in trauma response, as well as doing a lot of work with folks with like severe and persistent mental illness. So some of the more severe diagnoses, as well as the specialization in working with men and masculine identifying folks in particular around mental health. So I'll get into that a little bit here. Superpower I choose, I always choose invincibility, or not invincibility, invisibility. I always think that would be kind of cool to be invisible, but I'd love to see those coming in the chat. And I see some of those coming in, really appreciating that. The next thing I'll say about that is like, please be paying attention to the chat today. I'm gonna try to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm just not talking at y'all, but really, if there's anything that I hope folks really take away from today is that I'm hoping to really emphasize community within not only this space, but outside of this space as well. Community can be such a tremendous buffer. Community and connection can be such a tremendous buffer against some of the full impact of mental health issues, the full impact of this pandemic we've been going through, some of the other things we'll be talking about today as well. And so I hope folks can be making connections in the chat, noticing what your peers and colleagues and friends are saying in the chat and writing in the chat, because it's really about building community and connection. And you might see some common themes for folks and just how people can be empathetic with each other and relate with each other. So really emphasizing the chat. The other thing I'd mention is we are talking about mental health services today and mental health in particular, the pandemic, multiple things. And so really emphasizing that taking care of yourself piece as best as possible. I really love this quote here from Audre Lorde, but it's about really taking care of yourself. It's an act of survival, that self-care piece. And I love to be able to talk about self-care even more. But in this small space, what I would recommend is sometimes we're going to be talking about things around like race and racism. Honestly, we're going to be talking about health. People that have passed away potentially from this pandemic. Things around mental health issues, obviously. All that to say that there's going to be some things here today that's going to be either directly impacting you or indirectly impacting you. And so just want to recognize that and say, show up today as best as you can in ways that feel authentic to you. So if that's using the chat, that's great. If that means unmuting and saying something that you want to say, that's fantastic as well. If that means having your camera off, like I would love to see faces and stuff like that as much as I can, that's beautiful. But also I understand that if you're not feeling that today and you just need to shut the camera off, that's cool as well. Take your breaks, we'll be here for about an hour and a half. Get your water, go to the bathroom, no need to ask for permission for any of those sorts of things. Just be taking care of yourself as best as possible through that, throughout the rest of today. Loving seeing that, so keep that coming in the chat, and I'll be encouraging throughout today to be talking and just engaging in the chat as well. So why are we here, right? So one of the things that I wanted to just like set the tone with is a little bit about me that I thought could be like helpful to folks, and like, who's this guy coming in? So I thought I'd give y'all my first year in high school photo for y'all. So that's ninth grade for me. And then the arrow to my glow up, my senior year, that white suit, rocking that for prom. And that sort of thing. I got the facial hair, the sideburns are coming in for me, that sort of thing. And then what I more or less have looked like, that now is like a 3-year-old photo. So, you can judge. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Superfly, definitely appreciate that. But, a little bit about me. So I was born in India. I think this could be helpful just to give some context to where I'm coming from with some of the things I'm talking about today. But I was actually born in India and adopted by an Indo-Caribbean family in New York City. So I was actually raised in Queens. And when I say Indo-Caribbean, my family's mostly Indian, but because of things like indentured servitude and slavery, my family from India was uprooted and forced over to the country of Guyana, which is in South America, which was colonized by the Dutch and the British. And so in my family, there's like a huge mix of Afro and Indo-Caribbean folks. So African slave descendantry as well as Indian slaves and indentured servants. And so I grew up in Queens, New York, as in this Indo-Caribbean family, Afro-Caribbean family, and cool. New York City is great. Queens, very diverse. I moved from Queens to a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, when I was about 10 years old. And so that really impacted some of the ways I started to notice how things like race and culture and ethnicity were impacting my life. Our family in particular was the only family of color in the whole area, like our whole town. I was the only person of color at my school for the longest time. And so that really generated a lot of interest in me around just dynamics and background in people. I eventually moved from Georgia to Kansas. So we're seeing a common theme here of like, I'm kind of the one of the only people of color in my area of Kansas as well. But that's really where I started to really gain a lot of interest in, you know, therapy in particular, because I was noticing that I felt kind of alone. I felt very isolated. I felt very like, who around here can resonate with me or relate to me? During teen and adolescence too, like you're trying to establish a lot of independence from your family, which can be cool if you have other people that you feel like you can sort of relate to or find community. And I think I found that to be really difficult. All the while though, culturally, my family really wanted me to be an orthopedic surgeon. It was sort of like a culturally Indian thing, I think, for us to be like, you're going to be a medical doctor. Started out as pre-med in college, quickly realized I was not cut out for that. And I was really instead invested in therapy and mental health, something that wasn't talked about in my family whatsoever. As a cultural family that was Indian, as well as people of color, my family definitely had an understanding that mental health was more for like white America and white people. And so there was a lot of misinformation, right, about how mental health is impacting us. And so I decided to become a psychologist because I was really interested in that. There were some issues. My parents wanted me to be an MD, that orthopedic surgeon, and I decided to be a different kind of doctor. So if you came here today thinking that we're going to talk about the medical aspects of COVID-19, I'm so sorry that you've been misled. We're definitely talking about a different version of that, but I can certainly hook you up with some resources on the other side of that. All that to say that now I really just have an investment in just mental health, connection, relationships. I think a lot of that stems from how I was raised and some other things just around my background. But I just wanted to share some of that with y'all. And certainly if there's more questions about that, we can get into that in the panel, section of this. Okay, so kind of getting back to that first point that I was making before, right, in the intro. I use this word syndemic, going back, right, instead of pandemic. What do I mean by that? Yes, we have been experiencing a pandemic for sure, right? That has been going on for the last few years, a year and a half to 2 years, and that has been what it is. I felt like it'd be a little bit more accurate though to describe all of the things that we've been experiencing, right? As socially, social, politically, globally, all of that, but especially nationwide. And so this idea of this term syndemic, which really, I mean, I gave you sort of a more medical term of what that looks like. But what this is really getting at is that we might be navigating multiple issues at once, multiple afflictions at once, multiple health issues at one time. The pandemic is one really large part of what we're experiencing, right? And that's not to undervalue that in any way. But the truth is, we've been dealing with a lot of other things as well over the last, forever. Don't get me wrong, history is history. So it's been a long time we've been dealing with these other things, but especially highlighted the last year and a half, 2 years. So there's COVID. I wrote here, all those isms. So we're talking about obviously racism, thinking about things with Black Lives Matter, police issues, right? Brutality that we've seen on social media, in media in particular, that we're reading about. Sexism, things like when we look at how women in particular are treated, or these phobias of how gender is sort of being looked at it very rigidly in ways. So that idea of like transphobia, homophobia too, when it comes to sexual orientation. So all of these things can be really highlighted as well that we've been navigating during the last year and a half. We saw increases also in anti-Asian violence when it comes to the pandemic and how people are thinking about healthcare and disease and things like that. Also political leadership, one of the biggest things when I've worked with high school students over the last several years has been just this hyper attention to politics and hyper attention to just policy and what's going on, which can be great on one end, but also who are our political leaders and what are the messages we're getting from them, right? So even this idea of like, how safe do we feel? What's the state of the country and the world? How divided are we or not? These sorts of things, right? All that's going on. And so in the end, I really thought it was important to maybe replace that pandemic word, although that it can be very accurate, with a little bit more accurate understanding, especially when we're talking about mental health right now. This idea that we're really talking also about how these other factors really not only exacerbate and increase like the um, the severity of how COVID is impacting us, but also just how that's really impacting our mental health overall. Now, all of that is a lot of a downer. It's like, oh yeah, here comes Saeed talking about like disease and racism and homophobia and transphobia, and there's so much going on. And that's real though. And that's what I want to get across to folks. It is so much. And who can live like this, right? Like who is this built for? Who is this for? There's so much going on. And it's and everyone is experiencing this to varying degrees. And so I just want to, sometimes I hate using the word normalize because I don't know if anything's necessarily super normal. But what I will say, it's really common and understandable. If this slide felt overwhelming to you, it feels overwhelming to me as well. And it should probably feel a little overwhelming. And if you don't feel so overwhelmed by that too, cool. We would love to hear from you later about like how you've been navigating the pandemic and your own mental health, because that's awesome. We could learn from that, right? But I just also want to emphasize that there's a lot of opportunity that comes from this discussion today as well. So there is hopefully some hope for folks as we sort of move through this as well. One thing I want to point out too is like as questions are coming up through the rest of this little part, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, write it in the chat. If some of my wonderful leaders today could be paying attention to the chat for me if questions are coming in and I'm not noticing that, that would be great as well. So as we move forward, I wanted to, it was like, maybe half of today was going to be dedicated to some content around this and the other half was going to be around more of a panel discussion. So you can talk to each other and I can talk to y'all and that sort of thing. And so what do I want to really get across in the small, window for y'all? Well, what I wanted to talk about first is some of the more direct and indirect impacts that we've seen of this pandemic on what we've been experiencing. There's obviously been a lot of direct impacts. The health threat has been a very direct impact for many people, right? This idea of like, what is, discussions of contracting COVID-19 or the discussions of, family members or friends or people or people that know people. So there's a lot of discussions about those like health threats. What are the health threats? Guidance distancing or distance guidance and stuff like that. So, 6 feet apart and masks and all these other things, right? So very much being reminded on a daily basis and very consistent basis that there's health threats involved. Health can also mean a number of things, right? So although there's direct impact in health threats around COVID-19, this is also where I'm talking about things around violence and those things around like racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. So all of these like different health threats also coincide here as well. And that mental health piece of that. The stability, the lack of stability in a lot of things. Are we going to school or are we not? I'll tell you, at Northwestern, where I work, we sometimes didn't know when the pandemic was first really like coming. We didn't even realize. It was like one day I was in the office and the next day they were like, you are not coming back. And I didn't actually go back to my office. Oh, I went back to my office twice in the span of the year and a half. And so it's one of those things where one day we were doing one thing, one day we're doing it next. I have a lot of colleagues. I myself do not have children, but I have a lot of colleagues that do, who have been navigating childcare, who have been navigating, some students I work with who just who graduate high school, who I've been working with, who's, one day we were in school, another day we're not. We have some colleagues whose kids would sneeze in class and all of a sudden they were taken out of class. and like they had to get tested. They were gone out of class for 2 weeks. I know one class where there was like an outside row and an inside row inside of a class. And if somebody was sick on the outside row, the entire outside row went remote while the inside row remained in person. We're all figuring it out still, y'all. I mean, how confusing does that sound? And so I just really want to name this instability. When stability is really comforting, routine can be really comforting. And so I just want to name that, is that there's a lack of stability that's going on as well. Some of the indirect things, that thing I mentioned around social distancing too, but the school closures, the isolation, all of that, that direct and indirect overlap. But it's that idea too, is that like now, what are the other impacts of this instability, of these health threats? Now, are we expected to be anxious or feel fear around interacting with other people? Especially during, teenage years, it's like really important as we think of like over time in psychology. It's really important to be like getting to know people and establishing relationships with people, learning how to make friends, like learning what you like and don't like and interests and stuff like that. And this has really thrown all of that into a lot of instability, right? And it feels like you can be all over the place. So I want to name that we do know in some of the studies, and we have some limited studies, but we still have some studies on what's been going on during the pandemic. We really see that we're consistently breaking down those direct and indirect issues. The pandemic has contributed to various increases. And throughout today, I'm going to, at the end, I think what I might do is send some of these resources that I might name out to folks here in a second at the end, just so people have it. But what we do know is that this pandemic has like contributed to increases in a bunch of stuff. Anxiety, right, has been one. Worry, just that worry and anxiety go together. Helplessness. So people being like, okay, so you're telling me there's disease, there's racism, there's sexual issues going on. There's so much happening. So like, what are we to do with that? Access to supplies. People might remember at the beginning, especially of the pandemic, of people like panicking and rushing to get like stuff from the supermarket or the grocery store, right? Or people, limited amounts. I remember I couldn't find hand sanitizer anywhere. There was like people like selling hand sanitizer for like $40 a bottle, like on the train and stuff like that. I mean, there was stuff going on, right? Like a lot of stuff was happening. So that access to supplies would also increases anxiety, because especially if you're part of a family, yeah, definitely wild times. If you're part of a family or a unit where there's already maybe a certain anxiety about your supplies and lack of access, then that increases even more. That's a lot. And even if you are coming from a family that has maybe some more means and some access to resources and other things, that's still anxiety provoking because you're having less. And what does that mean, right? It's changing the fundamental way you've been living. Family finances, like what do you know about your family and the people that are raising you, and the finances? I don't know, but sometimes adults aren't the best at like communicating that with people, or talking about like how they're anxious about stuff or not, or they might be trying to shield their kids from the truth about how they're feeling about stuff. And so sometimes we're left wondering, like, what is the financial situation while so many people have been losing their jobs and all this has been going on? And that access to school. School can be so important. Now, I'm not saying everyone has the best time in school, that may not be your experience, but the fact that it's a change in routine that increases sort of the awareness of other people and the connection potentially with other people, adults and otherwise, that's really important. So not having that has really increased or decreased that access to school. So a lot of that's been going on. We also see an increase in behavioral issues in particular. So we've seen some substance use spikes with people of all ages, actually. So what that means to me is like that's alcohol and drugs and things like that. What we've been seeing is sometimes that's the way people have been choosing to cope. So that's one thing, but like it's another thing to also like, has that become an issue for folks, right? In particular, is that contributing to worse health for you, or whatever it may be, right? So really just monitoring some of the health issues, the academic challenges, and relationships. How do I keep up with my relationships? How do I keep up with school? All of that is going on. So I don't think like we needed giant studies to tell us this, but you know, people get paid a lot of money to do these studies. Y'all could probably have told us this in like a few sentences, right? But I think it's important to ground this is what we know about what's going on. And at least it can verify and maybe affirm and reinforce that this is what the experience has been for most people. Something. So I'm gonna call y'all, you know, Gen Zers for now. I don't like being called a millennial, which is what I am, but this is how the studies break things down. But what I wanted to name, and this is some questions that people sort of had, is what's been going on for folks that are within this quote unquote Gen Z generation, right? And so there's some studies that were done and surveys that were conducted breaking down Gen Z teens and adults. So really what that's ranging from is either from ages 13 to 17 currently and 18 to 23. So this is a survey that's really looking at ages from 13 to 23, that 10-year gap. And so this is a survey called the Stress in America survey, which is something the American Psychological Association, or the APA, does every year, where they figure out like what are the major health concerns, mental health concerns going on in America for folks. So I am part of the APA as a psychologist. I'm a part of various, I'm a researcher that does some work with them and other things. And so I just wanted to share this with folks, is that what we're seeing is that more than any other quote unquote generations that we're dealing with, right? Gen Z teens and adults were the most likely generation to say that their mental health has worsened during this pandemic as opposed to before in comparison to other generations. So even more than like my generation as millennials, or the Gen Xers, who are the folks above me, and the boomers, you know, who are above them, or, you know, my parents, that sort of thing, right? We're seeing that Gen Z adults and teens too are feeling more isolated. And you can see some of these numbers too. Around the whole US, almost half of US adults in particular are saying they feel very lonely during the pandemic. But Gen Z adults and teens in particular, and millennials too, a little bit behind them, are at 65%. So really think about like, 2/3. And that's, I think, very conservative, considering that sometimes people aren't even responding to these surveys, and who's like, how are they surveying people and stuff like that. It's always, whenever you see surveys like that, always understand it's probably even more than what people are saying here, right? So you can see here, just like those increases in loneliness. Also this idea that like Gen Z folks in particular really named needing more emotional support during the pandemic. And saying that they could have used more, and that's obviously present tense too, because that's still going on. And as a matter of fact, Gen Z teens and adults, folks that are here, are 4 times as likely as their older counterparts to report that like, hey, I really wanted some more support and I need some more support. So that's really important to remember too. And I think it's also important to remember that like physical aspects are also impacting people too. So, because of like the lack of connection, the lack of being outside, the lack of a number of things, people's physical health has also taken a dive in many ways, right? So younger adults and teens have reported the significant, about 75%, so 3/4 of people saying that, they're really, experiencing unwanted weight gain and some other physical health issues as well. And so, people have asked, and there's been questions about like, well, how is this impacting different generations of people and stuff like that? It's clear that, folks within, the age of many people that are here today, but those folks who right now are between the ages of 13 and 23 are experiencing even the most impact from what's been going on. So with all that in mind, why don't we take a deep breath on that? Because, that might be, have been a lot for y'all to take in. Like, damn, he's really saying something about how I feel right now, or like I've been experiencing this. And so what I would love to do is just have folks, if that works for you, just take a deep breath, fill those lungs with air, exhale, exhale audibly if that works for you. And you can do that again, just to take that in, because there's another theme here. I just want to reiterate that this is really about, recognizing what's going on for you. Because I think when we talk about all these issues, the first place I know sometimes our minds can go is like, well, what do we do about it? So let's do something about it. Let's create policy. Like, what can we do? What can we tell people? And we'll get there. But I want folks to check in with themselves, slow down a little bit, because that's all obviously going to be very helpful, honestly, to slow down and take it in. So what I would love to hear from folks, though, is like, I went through all those things that people are experiencing. What's it like to read what I was just like had up there as a slide, right? What's coming to your mind? How are you feeling in this moment? And I'll remind people of this is what I'm talking about. But how are people feeling right now? What's it like to read some of these stats or some of the things we just talked about? What's that like for you? So feel free to use the chat or unmute if that works for y'all as well. But again, want folks to be paying attention to what people are writing, because I think it'll be really helpful to building community. So I'll take a second and just want to hear how that feels. And some of our leaders too, if you want to unmute or you want to write in the chat too, please feel free to do that. So I see a couple of things coming in right now about being overwhelmed, right? Overwhelmed, yeah, a lot of consistent comments about being overwhelmed here. And a couple of comments about feeling less alone. Yeah, it's validating. Less alone. Irritated. Yeah, I wanna, yeah, for sure, irritated. I'd love to hear more about that too, Patrick, about what's irritating you, if you feel comfortable unmuting and saying that or writing that in the chat. I'm curious.
Like irritated in the sense, like, when are things gonna get better? Like, why do we have to be in this situation consistently?
Yeah, that's real. Like, just irritation, like I said before, like, how can anyone live like this? How can anyone deal with, like, what is this? Like, how long is this going? What are we navigating? For sure. We'll talk about that too. Tired, exhausted. Yeah. So, what I want to say to all this is, like, understandable. You should feel this way. If you do, it's understandable. Like this, how could you not in some ways, right? Feel sort of just a tiredness and irritation, exhaustion. I think it's also important, though, to point out too that there are other people that are feeling this way too, and I hope folks can really communicate that with each other, that they're also feeling this way. But I want that to be paying attention to that, about like this idea of when it's over and stuff like that, because I think the themes that we're really going to get into in a second is about really collective action and how it can't be just like one or a few of y'all really engaged with helping this situation, but it starts with from within, and we'll talk about some of the internal stuff that's going to be helpful, and then how externally, how other systems can come together to be really helpful with this as well. But I really appreciate folks who contributed to that. So a couple other things, some initial thoughts from me about some of what we've seen here, is, one thing that we know developmentally when it comes to psychology is that folks, especially around the ages of 13 to 18, this time in your life is really important to like navigate autonomy. So that idea of like, what's it like to just function independently or alone? What am I learning and not learning? And so that's a really important thing to try to figure out. But the pandemic has really limited that, right? This idea of like, now I'm less around people, I'm less around, events and opportunities to be more autonomous. I'm around family, potentially, parents, it could be other people that are raising us, all of that, right? Or like I feel more alone when I want to be feeling more like connected to folks. And so one thing I wanted to mention is that like I appreciate that there's like a lot of like, teens here and a lot of like young adults here and all of that. But I think what I also want to message and make sure people realize is that this is also for a lot of adults and folks who are raising folks to really be thinking about as well. Because what we found is that something that could be really helpful during this time, especially when raising, teens, adolescents, young adults, is to really figure out how to set an expectation that there's going to be some boundaries here, really have proactive discussions about like style and how are we going to interact with each other. So this idea of like even something like limiting screen time, for instance, right? Social media and stuff like that. That could be something that's positive that we'll talk about here in a second, because social media could be so much stuff going on. There's a lot of information there. But what we've seen is that parents and trusted adults and folks that are raising kids, adolescents, teens, young adults, what's really important is to be a little bit more collaborative with them around what can we do and how can we support you. So these ideas of really talking to teens in particular about like rules, expectations, how are they doing in particular, really trying to be a little bit more collaborative. And it doesn't mean equal 50-50 necessarily, but what it means is like just asking, y'all, like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? This is what I'm thinking about as a parent. How are you feeling about that? Right. And we actually found that most of the disagreements and issues between parental authority figures and their kids in particular comes from conflict they have about like boundaries and like how to parent and things like that, which is like understandable, but also really going that when conflict occurs, it's really about like allowing y'all space to sort of be a little separate, have your own privacy, and finding alternative ways to connect to others, but also finding ways to connect to your parents or your folks who are raising you in different ways. So what that might look like is like parents might want to have direct conversations with you, and that may not be your style. So maybe can we figure out, maybe we write letters to each other, maybe we text each other, maybe we do whatever, just finding alternative ways to communicate, I think could be really important. But really what I'm stressing here is intentionality, being really intentional about how you start to communicate with each other during this time. Because really what folks are looking at for the most when we look at some of our studies is like some sort of like power and agency and feeling like they can be in control of something, right? Because this pandemic has created and the syndemic has created, a lack of control for a lot of folks. And so we're hoping to instill a lot more control for people. And so can we encourage that? And can we find ways for y'all to encourage that with each other, right? So some of the practical suggestions that came out of that monitoring the social media. So I say I know because everyone's like, oh, we shouldn't be on social media and all that other stuff. Really, what I want to emphasize with social media and media content in particular is quality over and context over quantity. Meaning, like, what's the social media you're engaging in? Is it a mix of like even mental health services and pages that you could be following on Instagram or whatever, on Twitter? Like, is there like more positive stuff that you're also intaking, as well as some of the like real, like sort of impactful stuff that could be kind of negative or make you feel kind of negative, right? So really increasing that quality and context over the quantity can be really important. And so I encourage a lot of the parents I've worked with too to encourage their kids to continue to engage with social media if that feels okay, but really think about and talk about the quality and the context over the quantity of it. Same thing about checking in on mental health. So prioritizing empathy and validation over advice. So oftentimes parents and adults want to give advice. And so what I encourage them to do is instead just ask questions. And the same goes for y'all in here, that if you're, young adults and teens, is like to, sort of prioritize like with your friends or with yourself, like empathizing with yourself, empathizing with others, validating yourself and saying like, it's understandable I feel this way. Saying that to your friends as well. Folks aren't necessarily looking for advice, they're looking for that empathy. Something I stress too is like when people are complaining even about like the pandemic and all the work they have and all these other things they have, complaints are an opportunity to have more discussion. Like, oh, I'm curious about that. How, it seems like that's really like negative for you. How are you feeling about that? Right? Encouraging parents to do that with folks and adults to do that, folks, is really important. And doing that with your friends as well. Thinking about like when you say certain things. So sometimes what will happen is somebody will be like, my friend is experiencing X, Y, and Z, right? My friend is experiencing this and that. This is what my friend's going through. This is what's going on. This could be a good opportunity for parents and adults to like ask more questions about that. Like, oh, how are you feeling about that? How are you, impacted by your friend? How is that for you? And asking yourself that as well, and asking other friends that as well. So again, it's about being more intentional about how you're talking to each other. So asking those questions of self and others. I think talking about race and racism, especially right now with everything going on, is really important too. I'll give this resource later on when I'll send it to y'all, but there's something called Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race. But there's programs dedicated for families of color in particular to talk about how race has been impacting them. But there's also something called the Racial Trauma Guide. an allyship guide that is also helpful to like white families navigating discussions of race as well. So what we know more than anything during the pandemic is to like really help buffer against some of the impact of how people are experiencing symptoms and anxiety and depression and stuff, is to really come together and be a little bit more community oriented. And so that's going to be really important too. So can we emphasize being more community oriented? And that means recognizing that issues of race and racism are going on and they're very real, and we need to talk about that. And also, last thing that I'll mention is the open discussions of sex, gender, and relationships. So that idea that there was a study that we did called the Stressful Story Study, where we had teens and adolescents write different stories about what they are experiencing during the pandemic. And we had adults and parents, write what gender identity of the person writing what was the gender identity of the person writing this experience. And what we found is that like adults vastly like misgendered experiences and stuff like that, because they were being so rigid about gender identity and thinking that like, oh, men experience this, women experience this, with a lack of understanding of like gender nonconforming or folks who felt more fluid in their gender identity and things like that. And so what I also think, especially with y'all, that is a really good emphasis is sort of being less rigid in like discussions of gender, sex, things like that. Having adults be a lot more open to those discussions is really important to the mental health aspect of this. Like adults, especially right now, raising kids, need to be very open, and I think kids too, if you don't feel like you can be open with your family, it's recognizing who can you be open with, who can you have some of these discussions with. I think that's gonna be really important. And again, it always comes back to the quality and context over the quantity. That meaning that, are we having more quality conversations with each other, parents and kids, with themselves, kids with other kids, and teens with teens, whoever it may be? Can we increase the quality of those conversations? And again, that really goes back to increasing like the questions we ask each other, the questions we ask ourselves, like how are we doing? And so along with that, it's really about a few things. And one is like we've lost a lot of, there's a lot of importance to rituals that we take for granted. The idea of like what graduation is like. For example, there was an article I read about how I think at UC Berkeley, that university, they did a Minecraft graduation where everyone just had like their Minecraft, like, like folks from Minecraft, like they did like a virtual Minecraft like graduation for themselves with a virtual UC Berkeley campus and stuff like that, right? And it was like trying to like say rituals are important, like people have lost dances and proms, other ways to socialize. And so it's really about like, can you increase like some of those little rituals for yourselves? And what that could be is like, maybe you start writing a little bit more, do you keep a journal or whatever it may be? That's really important. Can you set some intentional time when you're actually talking to friends? Can you do like an intentional exercise with each other? Hey, can we just write together? Can we just like take a moment just to like sit with each other? Let's talk about like our favorite superpowers and what we'd want. Like being really intentional about like being organized about your time together, I think is going to be really important. Using those 5 senses. So even like, going outside, if you're able to go outside and embrace outside, close your eyes, take a few seconds to feel, what is it like being outside, right? What does the air feel like? What do I smell? When you're eating, being even more intentional about eating, what does this taste like? I think dentists say you're supposed to chew like 20 times or 30. I don't know, I'm not a dentist or anything. I don't know how that works, but, really being intentional about how you're eating, and all this might sound like really silly, but it's like, it's really about, or elementary, it's really about slowing things down and noticing how you're feeling and how you're responding. It's going to be really key. Recognizing the importance of resilience. So that idea of like, how much, how many like tools have we gathered throughout our life to like help mental health in situations, right? How much support do we have? The word resilience is always interesting to me too. You probably have heard that word, but just the idea of like, can we build up enough like tools to be helpful to ourselves, so when stuff inevitably happens, when mental health stuff happens or whatever happens, it's not hurting us as much. So that resilience is going to be really important. but also recognizing that resilience is actually a trauma response. If we're building resilience, it means we're building it from something, because something negative has probably happened. And so I love talking about building resilience, but I also don't want to gloss over the fact that if you're building resilience, it means something traumatic has probably happened. And so we need to recognize that. And there's also various ways to get involved too that we can talk about in the panel discussion. So all that to say, I know I went a little over, sorry, powers that be, my bad. Let's get into this panel discussion, but those were a few quick things I wanted to get into before we get into this panel discussion. So why don't we discuss? I'd love some questions, comments, let's get into it. So I'm looking forward to that. So I'm gonna stop sharing and we can kind of move forward with that.
Let me just quickly spotlight our panel guests. I think
Yeah, throughout this too, please be taking your deep breaths. Like I welcome questions. We're gonna have our panel. It's gonna be great. But you know, I would love to be hearing too in the chat or otherwise, like what's coming up for y'all for sure.
okay, these are our 4 high school students from Illinois Math and Science Academy. If you want to unmute and just briefly introduce yourselves, and then we will dive right into the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Suyemi. I'm a senior at the Illinois Math and Science Academy, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kosi. I'm a senior at Illinois Math and Science Academy, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, my name is Temi Akimolayan. I'm a senior. My pronouns are she, her, and I also attend the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy.
Hello, my name is Venus Abazwai. I'm a junior at IMSA, and I also, but yeah, no, I didn't miss anything. I'm just a junior at the Illinois Math and Science Academy.
So I think for this panel discussion, the goal was sort of having a conversation with the students about their experiences during mental health or during this pandemic as it relates to mental health. So if anyone wants to start the conversation about what it's been like to go through this this past almost 2 years and what that experience has been like for each of you.
Yeah, I can go ahead and get everything started. So I know as we go to IMSA, we actually live on campus, which is kind of an interesting take. So I think what made being in school during the pandemic very difficult was the fact that we couldn't see each other as much as we did. We went from hanging out every single day, working on homework together, to like not seeing each other at all and having to interact through Zoom. So I think the social aspect of, meeting with other people really took a hit on all of us, because we couldn't even do hybrid learning because everyone from our school is like all across the state, and it would have just been like a big hassle. So we were away from each other for over a year, and it was just very difficult. Especially like here, we have a lot of like traditions and cool like customs that we do, and all of that was just like taken away, or it was in some kind of like condensed version virtually, and it just wasn't as like memorable. But yeah, I think that was just a big aspect that made everything difficult throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Collaboration is a huge thing emphasized for like IMSA students. And so like going off of what Liz said, like being at home and like with our rigorous like workload and coursework, a lot of us did feel isolated because we kind of felt like we had to go through it alone. And like with collaboration, like it's hard to like set up Zoom meetings and like just to like study with your with your friends and do homework together. But like we did feel really isolated at home because a lot of our families don't really understand understand like what we really go through when we're on campus and the amount of work that we have to do every night, like in terms of studying and like projects. But isolation was a huge thing for a lot of us.
For me, one thing that definitely helped me during like the pandemic was like my family. They definitely like helped to like, because it was like really sad like not being with my friends and not being able to see my friends, and also like not being able to go out the house and like as freely because like a lot of things were shut down. But definitely my family helped and kind of like encouraged us like stay together and kind of like talk with each other and be with one another, and definitely my friends too. We had like a lot of Zoom meetings. We did homework together, and that was like our time to kind of like socialize. But it was like really sad to kind of like know how like it was like back in school, and like leaving school and like knowing like having all those memories that I have had with like my friends. And it was like kind of sad like just thinking about like those moments. And but definitely my family did help, and my friends, and having those Zoom calls helped me and my mental health.
For me personally, since like our first year at IMSA is as sophomores, like I started as a sophomore, so I didn't really have the experience of knowing what IMSA was like pre-pandemic. So like kind of going into it and kind of feeling frustrated by the online platform, and kind of felt like, should I continue going through with it? Because it kind of felt too hard or too much to do virtually to like be worth it to continue to be in person. And I know that like on the flip side, since we're a boarding school, there's a lot of people who come here to like feel safe from family. So I know like for me personally, it was kind of weird being at home with my family 24/7, and there were like a lot of boundaries crossed and things like that. So it was nice going back in person and like kind of having some of the distance too, because I know a lot of people here enjoy that.
Yeah, I wanted to mention just that point too of, the messages of how even if we're home, how that experience for folks is so different just depending on your family. And, there's some folks who live at home with folks who haven't been the best for the mental health, I'll say that, right? Or that can be harmful. And some folks have had okay experiences. And just wanting to validate that and kind of mention that that can be really complex given like people giving messages about distance and not being around each other. But like if that's like your main social support, what do we do with that? And so I just want to say too to that is what's interesting in a shift that we've seen in a lot of our studies of folks, especially teens and adolescents during the pandemic, is that usually like when you're a teen or you're a kid or young adult, you're really working on like figuring out like long-term things. It's almost like you feel at times like you have more time, right? And so sometimes if you feel like you have more time, you might focus on long-term goals and like building skills and things like that for long-term goals. And they tend to be things that we focus on, teens and adolescents focus on, that are very task-oriented, and a little like they're working on relationships, but not as intentionally. Whereas like older adults might feel like there's more limited time where they start really focusing in on relationships more, mental health more, emotions more. Going back to those stats I gave earlier, like folks my age in particular are really big right now on like trying to find a therapist, trying to do more mental health stuff and whatever. And so what we've seen is, especially during the syndemic or the pandemic, what we've seen is sort of a shift where what's actually been more beneficial for our teens has been in particular to really hyper focus more on like intentionality around relationships and mental health and emotions in particular. So really delving into like, how am I feeling right now? And I'll give folks a really quick example. At Northwestern, we're going through a lot of different stuff right now with relationships between our students, with like harm that's been caused to various students at Northwestern by other students, and talking about things like violence, like whether it be racism and that sort of thing, or sexual violence in particular as well. And what we found is we often go into a very solution focused mode where we're like, let's do a workshop, let's do, a panel or whatever right away on it. And one thing is like, that's really important and that's great. But can we slow down and also create more spaces where y'all can have more discussions like this with each other and focus a little bit more on how you feel, as opposed to like what we need to do, which will always be there. There's always options for what to do, but can we slow down a little bit and really build more intention into the Zoom calls, build more intention into what the hangout time looks like, build more intention into how you're talking to folks in your family, for example, right? So there's a lot of that. So just that shift of like focusing a little bit more on relationships, I think is really important.
So I'm curious for our students then, what has that, do you feel like you've had that intentionality as the pandemic is worn on? What has that looked like for you when it comes to shifting from seeing your friends in person to now having to be intentional about like your Zoom hangouts, your the times that there's a question from Maggie. It says, Dr. Hill, something that Venus mentioned made me wonder, how does one navigate a situation in which boundaries have been crossed because of the amount of time the pandemic has made us spend with our families?
That's a great question. And Venus, if it's okay with you, I would love to hear maybe an example or a little bit more of what you meant by the boundaries being crossed, if you feel comfortable with that. And yeah, if so, feel free to go ahead with that and I can answer off of that. And if not, I can go in my own answer.
Like for me specifically, it was about mental health because a lot of mental health problems came up for me during the pandemic, and it was like weird having to navigate that instead of like going to a school counselor where it was like confidential and I know that like I could keep it at school and away from home. It was more so that like my parents were being involved every step of the way, and like that was sometimes distressing at some points. I know that like I couldn't separate school from home. So a lot of the things that I would keep at school, like my identities that I would keep separate at school, I couldn't keep them separate anymore because my parents would be in the next room if I was like on a Zoom call with like classes and stuff like that. I'm not really sure if I had like a perfect solution on how to like navigate it. I kind of just tried to have conversations with my parents as best as I could. They didn't always work. But I tried to let them know that like I still have to do stuff as a student. So I'd like some personal space, or I'd like to be alone in my room when these various things happen. So I guess that's kind of the best way that I was able to go through it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Venus. So what I would say too with that is like, and it's frustrating sometimes to have to say this, but I think I'm always gonna like give it to y'all straight up, right? Like there's not necessarily a right way to do this, right? There's not a right way. And I think sometimes people are looking the right way to do it or the perfect way to do it, which also can just bring more stress and anxiety if you're trying to be like get the perfect way to do this, right? But there are probably some wrong ways to go about it, but there's no right way to go about it. So what I would say is like I love Venus's suggestions and what's been working out for them. But I would also say is this is where I know this is being recorded, and I just hope parents and families can watch something like this and hear what folks are needing, because that's what it really comes down to for me. I come from a family that culturally is really enmeshed. I mean, we're Indian folks who's like, my family is still always in my business. I'm 33 years old and they're always like in my business and trying to like tell me what to do and how to do it and stuff like that, right? So in some cases, like it doesn't necessarily go away. But what has been helpful is like my parents hearing a little bit more from honestly folks that look like me, who are a little older than me at times, to be able to tell them like, even across cultures, what's really going to be important is giving the space and giving the boundaries. And so what I've had to work out with some of my teens I've worked with and some of my like first year college students especially is like, can we find some spaces that you feel comfortable with where we can even have this Zoom call that we're having together? And can like folks be really encouraging of that? So is there spaces? So I've had some students who have had to just go outside if you're able to go outside, still close to the house if you need that Wi-Fi, something like that. Like you go outside. Is there another public place you can be? Are there friends that you're out actually allowed to see or be around, or family members you're allowed to see and go around that you trust, that you could go to their place and have like some more space that you trust, right? Like I think that importance of space and distance is really important here. And emphasizing with folks in particular, especially with y'all, when you are with your families or those folks that are, helping to raise you or whatever it may be, how do you use that time to talk to them? Now, there could be some like surface level kind of stuff going on, but what we see is like just increasing like more of like the check-ins a little bit more about like, hey, for example, with some families I've worked with, it's been, asking their kids in particular, hey, like, I know that you know, a lot's probably going on and stuff. I'm here to talk to you, but like, what can be helpful to just give you some space, you know, like having a conversation like that. And again, I know not everybody's families are going to be resonate with that as much. And it's so limited what we can kind of do for stubbornness. Like I've been working on adult stubbornness for a long time. And but I the most I could say is like if folks care about like what studies look like, what science looks like, what psychologists are saying who do this work, it is that importance of like we need to build in space, intentional space to be intentional with each other, but increase those boundaries with each other as well. And so what I would say is like I hope some of y'all can have those conversations and you can say like, hey, Dr. Hill, this dude I talked to today, like he said that this is what you need. He's a psychologist. Like, put him in, you know, truthfully too, put parents in contact with me. I don't mind. Like, I do not mind talking to folks about like the importance of this because I know my family culturally and otherwise, it was not always the case for them. So talking to them about what you need and how to come up with that time, we see such increase in connection between adults and kids when that happens. We see an increase in mental health and wellness when folks are kind of talking to each other about what they need and respecting those boundaries when they are. And if boundaries have to be broken for whatever reason, being really clear about why that is. So I know you want that space right now. I can't give that to you in this moment for these reasons. And I know you may not like it, but this is what we have to do right now. And maybe I can make it up to you another way. So those are some things that I'm thinking about, but really appreciate, Venus, what you were saying.
So the other three students, I'm curious, have you noticed changes in conversations around mental health in your families as this pandemic has gone on? Have you been able to openly talk to your families about mental health, or has your family even led that discussion?
I feel like now, since we're like on campus again, my mom particularly, like now, like when, cause like they don't see us for long periods of time, like at a month at a time or like weeks at a time compared to in the past, like when we were home every day. But I noticed that like now my mom will ask me like, okay, like how's everything going? Because like being a senior, there's a lot of stress going on with like college stuff and like the workload and stuff. But I noticed that my mom and my dad have like been asking me like, oh, how are you taking care of yourself? Like, are you eating like enough? Because me personally, like I'll study for long periods of time and not eat at times. And so like I've noticed that my mom and my dad are like, oh, how are you eating? Like, what have you been eating? And, like, how are you like taking a break from like doing like essays and doing homework? Because it's like really important now to like not overwhelm ourselves with everything that's surrounding us. And so I've like appreciated that because like compared to in the past, like that wasn't always a conversation like we've had, like like they wouldn't ask like how are things going, but now like they've asked more and more because of everything that's going around in like our society and our generation with like stress and like depression and things like that. So I've noticed that change a bit.
I've also noticed the change too. Especially like my dad, like one time he just like randomly called me and just said, "How are you doing?" Like he's never done that like before. Like when I was a sophomore, he's just never called me. And I was so confused when he called me. I was so scared. I thought he like something happened at home. So I just like called him back really quick. And he just said, asked us like, "How are you doing?" And like, "How are you guys doing?" Because like now like my brother, he also goes to the same school as me. So he called both of us and like made sure we're doing okay. And it was just like really nice to like just see like how like my dad is just like caring and like actually caring on like how we're doing. And then also like my mom like calls and checks in like every single day like every single day. Like she calls a little too much and like sometimes I'm like, "Mom, it's a little too much." But like yeah, it's like nice to like see how like my parents have changed and asking about my just like my mental health. And like instead of like asking like, oh, like instead of like saying, "Oh, you're not doing too well or not doing too hot," like they're asking like, "Oh, how are you doing?" instead. And they like it's definitely like a lot more comforting and it makes like me feel like a lot better. A lot. So
Gandy, can I just add really quick? Was it Temi? Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. So what you were saying in particular really resonated because I love that, and I love the idea too that families are like just checking in with folks. That's wonderful. And what I would also encourage too is like even that conversation or that question of like, "How are you?" or "How are things going?" is great. That's a great place to be. I also think what we've seen is that if we can increase some of the specific questions, that's even better for some folks, because how are you doing could be very overwhelming, because like, how are any of us doing, right, with all of this going on? Like, I don't know. So what I encourage a lot of folks to do, and this is not just like parents to their kids but it also goes to like y'all with each other and just conversations are happening, but ask some specific questions too, is like, hey, like, have you heard about so and so? How are you doing with like what you heard here, or what you read here, or what's going on here? Like, be a little bit more specific about it, or like, how's the mental health doing? Imagine how revolutionary that could be if like a parent, asked you, like, if my parents ever asked me like, how was my mental health, I'd be like, yo, whoa, like, what was that about? Like, y'all don't even believe mental health is a thing. Like, let's talk about that, right? Like, when I first told my parents I was going to be a psychologist, they literally said like, so you're going to get paid by white people to talk to you about problems. Like, that's their understanding culturally of what mental health is. And it took a lot of intentionality with them to get them to understand it's not that, right? So being specific about those questions and intentional about what you're asking too can be really important. So I just wanted to mention.
Yeah, I wanted to just add something really quick onto that question or onto that statement as well. For me, my parents actually started checking more in on my mental health during the pandemic as opposed to like when we came back on campus. So I remember for the first time, my dad like looked like he came into my room and he was like, how is your mental health? And I have Nigerian parents, so my mind was like blown. I was like, what did you just say? Like, what? And he's like, how are you doing? Like, I know, like, he, like, sometimes I would have to stay up like really, really late because I would be doing homework or I would procrastinate on homework. And he was like, I noticed you were up really late last night. Like, are you getting sleep? Like, do we need to like look into like, kind of rearranging like some patterns so that you can, get better sleep? Like little things like that they noticed. Like I didn't think that anyone was kind of paying attention to what I was doing because my parents are also like healthcare workers. So it was also just a stressful time for them. So like learning that they actually were still like, like observing little things like that about me, like really touched me a lot. And it was really, just kind of helped me keep pushing through to know that like people, even though everyone's like busy with their own lives and this pandemic caused like a lot of issues for different people, like are still looking out for each other. So
I also wanted to add on really quick because even though like what I said for the previous question, I think like I definitely have had a lot of benefits being at school now, and I think like it's a lot better now because my parents will call and they'll check in, and like I know that they're willing to help with things and like check in on how like whether I'm doing too much for my clubs, because I know that's something that I've gotten into like in years past, or like my parents will text because I know sometimes I'll be too busy that I can't call them back. So I think it's definitely been getting a lot better, and then like when we are not necessarily in the same space, they're still making like time to check in on me a lot better than they did when we were in like the same space all of the time.
This is really what I wanted out of this event. So no, this is great conversations. We're technically in the Q&A section of today's event now, so we will keep the same outline with our panelists and our speaker, and then I'll just be dropping some of the questions that were submitted by attendees. So one of the first questions was, how do you motivate yourself to take care of your mental health when your physical environment encourages an intense work ethic? And anyone can answer this.
Okay, so this week was like one of like the most stressful weeks that we've had because we just came back from like a extended. So definitely I was very stressed out, and one thing that kind of helped was just like talking to like my teachers, because I feel like my teachers here and like in this school, they're like a lot more supporting. Like there's some certain teachers that are like a lot more like supporting and kind of like understanding of like the issues like we kind of have, like they understand like I'm a senior, and like a lot of them gave me extensions and like kind of like understood how I felt. And then definitely like my friends, they motivate me to kind of like continue to study and do work. Like we'll stay up late together, work on problems on the board and try to like study for like the test and like do homework together. So they definitely motivate me. And like just to like for me like personally, like for like me being alone, like taking walks outside or like me, like I'm also like a manager of soccer, so like talking to like a different environment, like talking to a different group of people, that kind of like continues like to like motivate me and stay on top of my work. So yeah.
For me, I feel like I need to, I guess, kind of take care of my mental health, because if my mental and physical health aren't on the same level, then I know I'm not going to be able to like work as hard as possible or kind of like achieve as much as I normally could. I definitely think that like my friends help a lot. They help like kind of remind me, like you need to take a break. We've kind of been studying for like a couple hours now. Or sometimes like my RC, because I know like this weekend, my resident counselor was kind of telling me like, you kind of need to take a break. You've been really stressed out. So I guess like a lot of the people on campus help kind of keep me in check and like not just focusing on like the all of the work that I have to do, but also like taking care of myself at the same time.
Yeah, I know for me too. I just try to think about things like in the long run, because like right now in this moment, this period of time, like it's very stressful, and I may be tempted to stay up all night and pull like an all-nighter to finish all of my homework and everything. But you just have to think like habits like that can build, and you wouldn't want that to build. So no matter how hard it might be in the moment, I think it's just important to kind of take a step back and look at this and be like, will this really, have a huge effect in like 2 years from now? Like, what's going to be more important, like completing this worksheet or, getting like an extra like 2 hours of sleep? Like, I know it's not as easy to like kind of think about it that way as I'm making it seem, but I just try to remind myself like it's important to just take it easy on yourself sometimes, because there's just, your overall health is more important, your physical health, your mental health. So, if, I still might have like a worksheet to do or something, and a friend is like, hey, do you want to go on a walk with me? And I've been working all day. I'm like, I understand. I'm just like, okay, let me make memories. Let me enjoy myself. Let me have fun. Let me just take a step back, and this will get done when it's going to get done. But those moments of deciding to just put your mental health or your joy or your happiness over like school or whatever work you have to do, at times is just really important. So.
Can I just say, I love that answer, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for that. Because my answer would be very similar. And one thing I want to say just for myself, and I hope this is, resonates with some of y'all too, but this question of like, how do you motivate yourself, right, to take care of your mental health when your physical environment encourages an intense work ethic? I get a lot of that too, working at Northwestern. It's so intense, and like the students there are intense, and it starts from the top down. Like, our staff and faculty are intense and they're rigid, and it can feel like it just builds pressure. And one of the most important things I think for me, just getting older, that I've had to navigate and maybe come to realize is that my value as a person, as a human being, is not tied to my productivity. And I'll say that again, my value as a human being is not tied to my productivity. You're worthy and you're valuable as is, as human beings. And I think, that concept can be really difficult to grapple with or hard to resonate with in the society we live in, where it almost feels like, what's the next goal? What's the next thing you have to accomplish? Like, what are you doing with your life? Like the next thing, and so much. But I really love that advice or that guidance from Elizabeth, because I know what it's like to burn myself out. Like, I started grad school at 21, right out of my undergrad, and I never took a break or anything or really checked in with myself. And I burned myself out within 2 years of my PhD program. So much that I had to take a break. I took 3 years away from my PhD program. I left it completely and started working at a nonprofit in the community that was focused on like gender-based violence stuff and stuff like that, because I was like, I need to do something that helps provide me value and helps me slow down, and helps me feel confident again and helps me feel whole again. And so that idea of like, oh, leaving the work to go for that walk, please, I encourage you, please do that, because it and that's the thing. I know it's easy. Again, Elizabeth, you hit on this, but it can be kind of easy maybe to say that to a certain degree or whatever. But this is where it systemically comes into play, where we have to encourage folks who are making decisions too, who have responsibilities of making decisions and have power, to realize like we've got to give people some time and we have to be a little bit more flexible because the rigidity is just like, and I hope no one here is claustrophobic, but I usually give this example with my clients who have some anxiety, but that idea of like, if I were to trap you inside of an enclosed space and give you very limited options or no options to escape that, what would that feel like? And I think a lot of the times we talk about mental health and in a way that's like, oh, mental health, yay, let's do that, that's great, take care of yourself, but then we don't change at all our expectations, and we don't change at all the rigidity. So it's like the same deadlines, it's the same thing. We're trying to operate now in a lot of ways like we did before the pandemic, and it's just not sustainable for anybody, including those teachers who are trying to do that for you too. Those teachers trying to function in pre-pandemic levels, it is not going to work. And so the most I could say is like just giving yourself more flexibility. And I hope that adults, can hear that, and people making decisions, teachers otherwise, can also hear like we need to put into place some intentionality around like creating spaces where we can slow this down, because it's really important.
That was awesome. Our next question is, how do I talk to my parents about my friends being part of my support system when I come from a family that doesn't understand this concept? I think Dr. Hill, if you want to start us off with that answer, and then our students, if you have opinions for that as well.
Yeah, this is a tough question, and this is a question I resonate with a lot, again, coming from where I come from culturally, where it was like my family being like, you have your family, why do you need what else do you need, right? As great as y'all are, I'm gonna go over here with these people because I need that. I think this could be tough from multiple angles. I think so, again, not an easy answer, because the answer is at times contingent on people kind of getting it, or like resonating or hearing reason and logic. And I want to say this too, is like, I know that that's not going to be the experience for everybody, right? And so there's like a kind of a twofold answer to that. One is like, how intentional are you in having those conversations with your family on one end? Like, if they can be a little open to it, it's sort of like, hey, explaining, what does that being part of your support system mean? It could mean like, hey, I experience like these friends that I have, they're people that express a lot of gratitude for me, or they really like me, or they express love for me. And they help make me feel a little bit better, or help me function a little bit better. And so what I found is like just being with them and being around them, not all the time, but like, if I can just be around them more, talk to them more, it's just helpful to me overall. It's helped me. And sometimes with parents, especially if they're culturally like mine to a certain degree, sometimes it's important to give them sort of like the specifics of how they're helpful to you. So it's almost like a slide deck of like, this is what they contribute to my life, let me break that down. But minus that, it's sort of like being clear with them about how that really is helpful to you, and maybe how that's helpful to you as part of the family too. When I have these folks, like maybe your parents or family don't want to hear everything, going on, like, hey, these folks are helpful because they give me a different perspective, or they're just helpful to me in that, like, I don't have to talk to y'all about every single thing, and I'll always be like checking in with you, but this is also important for me, and it's part of natural, like, just development. I mean, it really is. Now, if they don't understand this concept, I think where that comes into play is like where other adults can be helpful to you, so that whether that's be through school, like, do you have anybody else that you can sort of identify that can hear you out on that and help like troubleshoot that a little bit for you, who might know you more than even I know you, right? And I don't know any of you, but like if you have adults in your life that can help you like think through how to have those conversations or how to build those spaces on your own. So even if like, you can't necessarily physically hang out with your friends, or your family isn't resonating with that, it could be like the time that you do get with them, those friends, like whether that be online, virtually in like a Zoom thing, or like playing video games or whatever it may be, can you really increase that intentionality too? Like, hey, I know we're playing this game together, but can we take like a few minutes just to like check in and chat and that sort of thing? So really, a lot of this isn't going to be a solution to like preventing those issues, as much as sometimes it's about like harm reduction, if that makes sense. So that idea of like, we may not be able to solve this issue, but is there, with the parents, they may not resonate with this, but are there other things we can do around ourselves to help when our parents reject some of that, or a family rejects some of that? where we can still build up some of that resilience I talked about before, or build up some of the tools to like we can still function properly even without our parents completely being really accepting of that, if that makes sense. But I would love to hear like advice from other folks too, from y'all. I would love to hear y'all's answer.
Okay. Yeah, this question's a bit more difficult for me to answer because I don't know if I've like ever been exactly in this position, but I know sometimes like if I'm trying to talk to my parents about something and they may not completely understand or may not like yeah, they just can't really understand what I'm talking about. Sometimes I like utilize the help of my brothers or my siblings or my other siblings to help with that. I don't know if you have siblings, but sometimes just if it's like my brother and I, and we're kind of like, I don't know, tag teaming with them and like kind of both trying to explain to them, sometimes that like helps a bit more because it's like a backup. So my parents aren't just like, oh, it's just you, like you're kind of like, what are you talking about? Like my brother's with me, and then they'll be like, oh, okay, you're both kind of thinking this way. So I hope that makes sense, but that's just something that, oh, it sometimes would work.
I know it's a lot easier for me now at IMSA because then I get to tell my parents, like, I spend the majority of the week with these people. Like my roommate, I'm spending a ridiculous amount of time with her. And then like these people are there for me when you can't physically be there for me. I know that like even if I wasn't in a residential school, I'd probably be able to say that like I still spend like 8 hours of the day with these people. So I guess like the kind of time that you spent with them can kind of be a big indicator. Like I love my parents, but they aren't always going to be physically there for me, and just kind of explain to them that these are the people who are there when you can't be there for me, and they also kind of like help me out.
Really quickly, can I say sometimes adults are really insecure about their relationships with their kids? You know, even if they don't put it out there like that, they can be really insecure, and it's not fair to have to do this sometimes. But if you have the energy for it, being able to validate, you shouldn't have to, but sometimes the ego and other things. But if you have the energy to validate your family or your parents of like, hey, like exactly like that, like, hey, you know, these folks are there for me too. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to talk to you, even if sometimes maybe it does. But like, you know, sometimes I don't want to talk to you and this is just helpful to talk to other folks. That's great, you know, but just kind of validating, like, I know you're there for me too. And I know I can come talk to you if they've created that kind of space for you, but just sometimes that validation can help with the connection because it could be two ways, right?
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said so far. Like, especially with like the siblings thing, because I also have a brother that's in college currently, and a lot of the times, like the IMSA workload is compared to like college workload, and so sometimes I'll just like call my brother, and so that like we can talk to my parents together, and so they can understand everything that like we're both going through. And then with like friends, also friends is a huge thing, and like because obviously our friends are going through the same things we're going through the same classes and stuff like that, and so I'll try to reassure my parents that like yes, like I'm always going to look to you for support, but my friends are kind of understanding what I'm going through more right now because of like the classes that we're taking and the homework and the assignments that we have to do together. And so I just think the most important thing is just telling them that like, yes, you will always be there for me. And yes, I'll always seek you for support a lot of the times, but my friends are also going to be there for me as well.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Yeah, and for me personally, sorry.
Oh, no, you go. You speak.
Okay. So for me personally, yeah, my parents like to be part of like everything, like every step of my life. So like it's definitely like it's sometimes a little too much, like it's a little choking, like they want to be part of like every step of my life. And I'm just like sometimes I have to like remind them like my friends are still here. They're also like a support system because they're like a strong believer that family always like comes first. And I'm also a strong believer of that too. But like definitely friends are very helpful and like getting you through things. So like I guess like try and remind them like my friends are like a good support system, and they also are like very helpful in like keeping me on track and keeping me on good terms.
So we have a couple more questions, and the next one is, how can we make students that suffer from mental health issues feel better at school?
So I'll jump in there for a couple of things because honestly, it could be so many things. But I think I would so fortunately or unfortunately, I think this is a really it's going to be a time where we're all figuring out how to navigate this all together. And I think what we find has been really helpful are for folks like you to really take the initiative in ways to kind of detail to folks at school, like whether that's a principal or otherwise teachers, what would be helpful. And what I've seen with some of our high schools, especially at Evanston Township High School, which is like I do some work with Evanston Township High School in Chicago. And one of the things or in Evanston, obviously. But one of the things we've built in is like some intentional spaces, even after school or before school, for folks to come together to like just have almost like a mental health check-in before school starts or after school starts, before class, during class. Like these sorts of things can be built in, right? Like, can we do just vibe checks is what I call them, but like mental health check-ins, like how are we feeling? How are we doing? Inserting more ritual, that going back to that whole ritual thing I talked about before. And I'm about to put several resources into the chat here, but in particular, one that I wanted to mention was that second one, which is written by a graduate from 2020 from college, but at UC Berkeley, it was kind of going into that. But that idea of like the importance of ritual. So when we start class, can we start it a specific way every time? Can we build connection that way? Just building stuff into class and otherwise, that could be really important. Something I want to also point out too is the second from last resource, which is about like what some youth are doing around the world when it comes to pandemic response. There's a cool video about how to get involved with things like that. But I think in particular, there has to be policy in place within school to really increase some of those support spaces in school, increase maybe mental health groups. I think this also starts with like, can we increase like funding for more school counselors, for better training for our school counselors too, I'd say, but also just increasing our school counselors and the diversity of our school counselors. That may not always be up to school. That has to come down to funding and other things. But I think, you know, that building those intentional spaces before, after, and during school for connection with each other, as well as like increasing some of the mental health services at school. And that's going to be just vital to these conversations. But it really starts with teachers also asking those intentional questions, like I was mentioning before, that we want parents and other adults to be asking. So those are a few things. And some of these other resources are things like Teen Wire, which is a lot, you know, for teens to just ask some questions, read some articles about like life right now, sex, etc. I think is another thing that could be good around like sexual issues for teens and adolescents. But like these are some resources that I think could be positive.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would like to add at our school, there's been a lot of work done with increasing like mental health transparency and implementing resources to make sure that everyone is taking care of their mental health. Just because of the environment of our school, it's very rigorous. There's a lot of, it's like pretty high stress, high pressure environment. So throughout the years, like I think this year they just added like another counselor, another mental health counselor. So now we have 3 total at the school. And I know we have this thing called like stress mods. So a module is like a class period basically. And if you're feeling extremely overwhelmed or there's just a lot going on, I know you can like go to the counselor and you can just like talk about what's going on, and they will like excuse you from class for that time so you can go and like work on your other work, or you know, do what you need to do to just kind of like decompress and like take a second. So I know our school really tries to support students' mental health, and specifically some teachers as well. Like teachers often ask us like we're seniors, so a lot of my classes, my teachers are like, I'm trying not to, you know, assign a lot of work around like November 1st, for example, because we know like you have a lot of applications due, or some teachers are just like, you know, it's been a stressful week. What do you guys think about like pushing back a test or a homework assignment or a quiz? Just because, you know, we know they're trying to be really empathetic and understand what we're going through. So I think those are some steps that like different schools can implement within their own school systems as well.
At our school, we also have this thing called MHI Week, which is like Mental Health Initiative Week. And it's like an annual thing we do. And it's like during that week, it's like there's a lot of like activities that we can do just to like de-stress. Like sometimes they'll bring like therapy dogs in so like that the students can just take time to like not think about homework. And we also have like an assembly where they invite a speaker and like we just talk about like the importance of mental health and just the importance of taking a break and not always thinking about schoolwork, but like the importance of just not always like doing work and just having a time to like de-stress and like not and like be with friends as well.
I want to ask if any attendees want to unmute and ask a question. I want to give you the chance to do so right now as well. Okay, in that case, I will just ask one final question. And so a lot of our conversation today has been surrounded mental health and kind of lessons learned during this pandemic. And I guess the question that I want to leave us all on is how do we, like, I think right now it can be easy for people to think mental health is being talked about right now because it's impacting so many people, right? We're hearing it called that there's a mental health pandemic going on as well. So, and it can feel almost like what's in at the moment. So how do we actually continue to prioritize mental health going forward, especially as we continue to juggle this sense of when will this pandemic end? Will it ever end? So I'm curious to our speaker and our panelists, how do you intend to continue to make mental health a priority moving forward? And what sort of last pieces of advice would you all like to share today?
I think personally, like emphasizing it in like social circles is important. I know especially like telling students in like the grade below me at school that like it's okay to take a break, because I think that's one of the bigger things that like people are struggling to feel not guilty about, or kind of in our like environment at school, like it's okay to take a break or take a mod off or kind of put stuff off until you're feeling a little bit better to do so. Kind of do those things. And then I feel like I think it's just including it in all of the conversations that you have to kind of show that it is something that like it shows up everywhere, and it's not something that should be kind of like touchy to talk about, or that it can be talked about everywhere and anywhere if necessary.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know, do y'all get like syllabi and stuff at the beginning of class, like detailing like what yeah, you still do that, right? So that's one thing, an area that I saw could be really important for teachers, like examine that syllabi or the syllabus and see like, is there discussion of mental health in there? I know some teachers who have like granted mental health days, which I think could be really good, where those are, unexcused or whatever, there's stuff to work out from a policy piece with schools and universities, but I think that could be really important. But so building that into even on a school level into your syllabus could be really good, like how to do response to mental health issues, like if there is a mental health concern, who to reach out to, what are the resources, that should be part of it. I think on an interpersonal level, granting permission to each other to feel and the importance to heal around some of that is really going to be vital. And I think that starts with modeling. I think like folks like myself to model like having those conversations to the point that's already been made, like building that more into the conversation on day-to-day basis. Already where we are in these conversations is way different than where I was when I was in high school. Like we were not talking about this whatsoever. An event like this would have been like, what? So foreign. And so it's really cool to see that. And so building it into the everyday, modeling it and encouraging our adults to be modeling that, and encouraging y'all, if you have the capacity, to be modeling that for each other too. And also starting to build it into our actual structures. So putting that in that syllabus, making that a priority for our principals in our schools. And that even extends beyond to like Congress and stuff like that. Can we pass legislation? Right now in this country, on average, we have one mental health professional in a school per every 1,400 students. That's how little we have mental health clinicians in public schools right now. So 1 in 1,400 approximately. So, can we have Congress or whoever expand things like Medicaid, other things? So there's a lot of policy things that could be kind of boring that are really important, but at least bringing it up day to day and modeling that this is important and getting it into like the paperwork, getting it online, building that in. And those student groups, I wrote that in the chat, but like if we can have some sustained student groups around these issues, that's really important too. My position at Northwestern, working with men and masculine identifying students around the issues of sexual violence, that existed because students came together and created a masculinity group dedicated to masculine mental health. And out of that, we figured out like it would be helpful to have like someone have a position at the university to supervise this. And then my position came about eventually from that. So students have a lot of agency in helping to drive this if it's important enough to.
I think one important thing to know is that like we all have different ways of like taking care of our mental health. And so I think it's important to like analyze yourself and like see what ways work best for you. Like personally, like I like to take naps a lot. Like I like to sleep a lot, and like I like to like watch Netflix and stuff. So like what I'll do is like I'll take a break from homework or from writing essays just to like take a quick nap or just to watch like a quick show or something. And like for other people, it could be going on walks or talking with friends. And so I think it's just important to analyze yourself and see what works best for you. And because it's not going to be the same for everyone else.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note too that, and Dr. Hill was like touching on this, that, mental health issues during the pandemic might have been exacerbated, but just because the pandemic will end eventually doesn't mean that mental health issues will also end. So I think it's important to keep, talking about mental health and like checking in with yourself. And, even for teachers too, I know a lot of teachers are like, oh, I know the pandemic did a lot of like mental health damage to people, but like I think it's important to realize that mental health was an issue before the pandemic and it's still going to continue to be an issue after. So just like keeping in like those like built-in structures like Dr. Hill was saying, I think is very helpful.
Really quickly, Elizabeth, if I could say something about that, is that we actually know based on a lot of trauma studies that sometimes the full impact of like global trauma even won't even impact folks sometimes fully for another 2 to 4 years after. And I say that not to make people feel like, oh gosh, here we go, 4 more years and I gotta be healing. No, but it's a really good thing. It's almost like we can predict the future to a certain extent, going back to that superpower thing. So that idea that we can start building those structures now, knowing that sometimes the full impact of this won't be even seen for another couple of years. And can we really build some preventative measures in place to address it when it gets to that point, right? So it's not to say that it's not impacting us now, it is, but sometimes the full impact isn't even seen 2 to 4 years from now. And I say that as a kid who lived through like 9/11 when that happened. I was a kid, I was born in 87. So you could see how old I was, in 2001. And it was like a little while longer where I was like, wow, how this is sort of affecting me. But it would have been so nice to have some structures really built in place before that to buffer against when that eventually comes. And so that's an importance of that too to mention.
Yeah, and like I'd like lastly like to say like definitely just keep in touch with your friends and like making sure like they're okay too, because definitely it was nice to like make sure like my friends are doing well and like other family members and how they were doing and how this is like affecting them in the long run. And also like just like trying to like like bringing like a good support system and like if you're feeling affected, like going with like teacher and telling them, oh, like I'm feeling affected by this and that, and like definitely just like talking, it's very, very helpful. So yeah,
Thank you. We are a little over, so I will now pass it on to Maggie to wrap us up.
I just want to thank everyone here, especially Dr. Hill, Tammy, Venus, Elizabeth, and Cozy, because they took the time this Saturday, which is turning out to be quite a sunny Saturday. So I hope we go out and enjoy it. to take the time to talk about something that obviously keeps coming up, not only in high schools and undergraduate programs, but just in general, it keeps coming up. So I appreciate every one of you taking the time to have this conversation with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. This event was recorded, so we will also be sharing the recording with you all. And Dr. Hill has graciously also provided his slides, so that will also be shared. And then I've collected the links, resources that he provided in the chat, so that will also be shared. And we will have future events as well, so look forward to those. But again, just thank you all so much for joining us for this important conversation, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank you.